This Shabbos, we're reading Parsha Shoftim, and we begin the Parsha today with something from Rav Moshe Feinstein. The first pasuk in the Parsha begins, Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sharecha, asher Hashem Elokecha nosein lecha l'shvatecha v'shoftu es ha'am mishpat tzedek. Shoftim v'shotrim, judges and officers, you shall appoint in all your cities, which Hashem, your God, gives you for your shvatim, for your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha. Rav Moshe Feinstein is curious and wonders about the word lecha. Titein lecha, you shall appoint. What does that mean? Says Rav Moshe as follows. Titein lecha, we begin here. Titein lecha, lechora, lecha miyusar. Apparently, the word lecha is somewhat superfluous because it could have just said shoftim v'shotrim titein b'chol sharecha. Why the lecha? U'Ba'or HaChaim amad bazeh, and the Or HaChaim HaKadosh discusses it, and see what he says. V'nira, says Rav Moshe, I'm going to tell you what I think it means. Shabala horos, it's coming to teach us. Sheha'adam tzarech lihiyos shofet al atzmo. A person has to be a judge over himself. Imas of metukanim, if his actions are appropriate, his actions are correct. So he has to be a shofet, he has to judge himself. But more than that, v'gam shoter la'atzmo, he also has to be a policeman. He has to be someone who's enforcing la'atzmo, himself. Not only does he have to judge himself properly, but he has to make sure that it is done properly. Moreover, liknos atzmo, he should fine himself, he should punish himself somewhat, in a way that he is going to make sure it's done. He has to do somewhat to guarantee that the actions will be done properly. Sometimes you have to take an oath in order to solidify your commitment. Kaha, as the Gemara tells us in the Dorim, nishbar l'kaimes mitzvah, that we can take an oath to fulfill a mitzvah. In order to make our commitment to the mitzvahs stronger, we can take an oath. V'nitztava. Moreover, the Torah tells us here in Parsha Shoftim, one of the requirements of the judge, or one of the requirements put on the judges, is that he should not pervert judgment. Same thing personally. We should be very careful never to pervert the judgment on our own, for ourselves, in our personal lives. We shouldn't show favoritism. Lomar, to say, yeah, I'm such a good guy. It's good what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. A person should not justify and try to figure out a reason, come to playing with ideas. Ella, we're on line 10. A person has to think that he's just a simple person. A person should realize that. Don't take a bribe of hana'ah. What I'm doing is good. In other words, don't let a pleasure in doing something bribe yourself emotionally, bribe yourself psychologically into thinking that the act is worthwhile or permitted. Don't try to convince yourself of that. Don't try to rationalize. Ella, what should you do? Tzedek. You should be righteous. You should do the right thing. You should follow a proper beis din, meaning you should do what's right. Have yourself a mentor, have yourself a rebbe, katzas chazal, as the Gemara tells us. as we find by the king, which we will discuss in a few minutes, which is also a mitzvah in today's parsha about the melech. We know that since a person's a king, he has a heter to be proud and to make himself into something greater. And maybe be lenient in certain things because he's the king. No. There's a special issur about becoming haughty of oneself and to be lax in certain mitzvos. A person should not tolerate in himself any laxity or any deviations from mitzvos, as the king is told he has to do that. Just because a person is a Talmud Chacham or whatever, person has to look in themselves. He's commanded that specifically. So the idea of Shoftim v'shotim titain lecha, there's a mitzvah to appoint judges, but Rav Moshe says there's a remez here for ourselves. We have to judge ourselves. We have to create within ourselves a system where we realize what's right and what's wrong. We shouldn't bribe ourselves, again, psychologically, emotionally. We shouldn't try to pervert any justice. We shouldn't try to show favoritism in certain things. Person has to be straight, as a judge should be in dealing with themselves as well. Okay, the Torah continues in a couple psukim later. It says, Ki ipale mimcha davar bein ki ipale mimcha davar la mishpat bein dam ladam bein din ladin vein nega lanega divrei rivos b'sharecha. Okay, so this is the halacha of also the Sanhedrin, that if there's something that the a Beis Din is not sure, a person's not sure, a Beis Din's not sure, so between blood and between any type of verdict and bein dam ladam, between different types of blood, Rashi says bein dam tameh ladam tahar, bein din ladin, Rashi says bein din zakai ladin chayav, innocent or guilty, etc. So the Torah says bein nega lanega, and between a nega that's tameh and a nega that is tahar. So divrei rivos b'sharecha, in matters of dispute in your gate. So what should you do? So then you should rise, you should go up to the place that Hashem will choose, which is the Sanhedrin on Har Habayis. And Rashi here says, why does it say v'kamta v'alisa shebeis hamikdash gavoa mikol hamakomos? That the Beis Hamikdash is higher than all places. Okay, so Rav Meir Shapiro, the Rav who started, whose idea was Daf Yomi, famous Rav Meir Shapiro of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, just wants to say something fascinating in this pasuk. Rav Shapiro, as we said, started the Daf Yomi in 1923, Rosh Hashanah 1923. Unfortunately, he wasn't, he passed away in the early 1930s at a relatively young age, and he didn't live a long life, unfortunately. But he was alive during the 1920s, and he was alive during the early part of the 20th century when there were terrible things that were going on in Eastern Europe. And so Rav Shapiro says, look at this pasuk. He says, Im tispale v'tishtomem, if you're going to wonder, bein dam ladam, the Jewish people, Klal Yisrael, distinguishes, as we mentioned before, as Rashi says, dam tameh, dam tahar. We look at blood and we're very careful. We don't eat blood. We make sure that there's some that's tahar, some that's not tahar. But blood is something that the Jewish people really try to avoid. So says Rav Shapiro, Im tispale v'tishtome ben dam ladan. If you see that we are very careful when it comes to blood. He says, how could it be the absurd idea that we are always accused, often, not always, but very often accused of ritual killings, which are known as alilas dam, blood libel. As you all know, the blood libel was a terrible, terrible accusation, false accusation that was made up by our enemies to say that the Jews would kill non-Jewish children and use their blood for ritual purposes, usually around Pesach. And anyway, that was unfortunately, as we said, an event, an accusation that happened countless times throughout the Middle Ages. But we're very careful when it comes to blood, and they use blood to accuse us that we're using blood. We abhor blood. And if somebody wants to eat a piece of meat, you have to soak it, you have to salt it, you have to get out all the blood from the meat. So there shouldn't be a piece, a small little drop of blood. That's how much we hate, we hate having blood. That's the first phrase in the pasuk, ben dam ladam. Then it says, ben din ladin, which we translated as between a verdict, one verdict and another verdict. A verdict of ben din zakai, ladin chaya, a verdict of innocence to a verdict of guilty. Shekach tizak mara, screaming at us, Ribbono Shalom. Kasafta b'torascha, it's written in the Torah. V'shor says, "Oves b'no lo shishchatu b'yom echad." We have a halacha that we don't shecht an animal and a mother and its child on the same day. V'halal horgim b'yom echad avos v'imos al b'neim u'b'nesayim v'yata shosek. We're so careful of a positive verdict, a negative verdict, guilty innocence, and if we look at the world around us, so they accuse us of blood libels, and here they don't care who's chayav, they don't care who's guilty, who's innocent, they just take everybody, and this is before the Holocaust, he wrote this, they just take everybody on one day, avos v'imos, fathers and mothers, al b'neim u'b'nosayim, sons and daughters, v'yata shosek, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't say a word. We're so careful not to shecht an animal and its child on the same day. An animal and its child, we have a halacha, we don't do it on the same day. And we're treated the way the non-Jewish world treats us. They take mothers, fathers, kids, and on the same day, they just completely get rid of them. Ube nega la nega, between an affliction, nega tameh la nega tahar, tishal. How does the world look at us? What happens to us? We parshas nagam lamadnu, from the parsha of Nagayim, from the parsha of afflictions, we learned. She'ena kadosh baruch hu pagea benafshos tchila la machala kaso al eitzim avonim. We learned, as the Medrash tells us, from Sikta Rabasi, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not afflict human beings first. First affliction comes upon eitzim and avonim. But now look at what's happening to the Jewish world. Akolu hamaratzchim achzorim es Yaakov. The murderers, the evil murderers, they're coming and taking us. Knesset Yisrael ha'Yisrael Meshizol l'cherpa l'harug l'habed. Kadosh Baruch Hu, we learned benega tameh lenega tahar. We're very careful when it comes to afflictions, and they're afflicting us without a second thought. Ki yipalei mimcha davar. When you look at the world, ben dam ladam, the way they treat us when it comes to blood, accusing us of blood libels. Ben din ladin, When it comes to verdicts, they don't care who's chayev and who's innocent. They just are getting rid of the Jews. They are just afflicting the Jews. Bein nega lenega, when it comes to an affliction as well, there's no concern for who it is. Says Rav Shapiro, you know why it's happening that way? You know why it's happening to the Jews that way? It's very simple. Divrei rivos b'sharecha. Im yipalim mincha kazos. If all this is you're wondering why this is all happening. Lama basanu hatzara hagdol azos. Why did all these things happen to us? Dalacha. There's one reason, and it's clear in the pasuk. Al divrei rivos b'sharecha, because of the matters of disputes in your cities. Avon sinas chinam garam kazos. They're fights, they're disputes, they're arguments for no reason. Sinas chinam. As Chazal tell us, the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam. And until the sinas chinam goes away, the second Beis HaMikdash will remain destroyed, and there won't be a third Beis HaMikdash. And so that's bein dam ledam, bein din ledin, bein nega lenega. These things are happening because of, says Rav Meir Shapiro, because of divrei rivos b'sharecha. Uva avon zeh, because of this terrible sin, higalnu mi'artzenu v'nisrachaknu me'al masenu. We were taken into Galus, and we were scattered and spread throughout the four corners of the world. And that's why we're unfortunately still enduring this terrible, evil Galus. This again was written in the early 1920s, something that Rav Shapiro said, how he understood this pasuk. If you're wondering why, bein dam ledam, bein din ledin, bein nega lenega, the reason is divrei rivos b'sharecha, because of all the fighting and the arguments amongst yourselves, amongst your gates. And the Torah tells us that, back to the pshat and the pasuk, it says if there are these disagreements in halacha, again, the pshat and the pasuk, so we're supposed to go to Yerushalayim, to the Sanhedrin on Har HaBayis. And the Torah says, you should go to the judge who will be the judge in that day. Well, obviously, what other judge am I going to go to? Rashi says, Rashi says, Afilu eina kishar shoftim, even if he is not like other judges, shahayu lefanav, who came before him, atat tzarich lishmo alo, you must listen to him. Why? Says Rashi, ein lecha ela shofet shebiyamecha, you have none but the judge who is in your days. In other words, that we might not have judges of the caliber that lived in the previous generations, but that's immaterial. These are the judges that we have, and we have to go to them. There's an unbelievable story that's told by Rav Pinkas in his Sefer Tiferes Shimshon. This is just a phenomenal story. Listen to this. Based on this pasuk, that you go to the judge in your day. He says, the Torah was given for the Chachamim in each generation. And each generation has the responsibility to listen to their Gedolim. Whether or not we think that they're great or not, it is the responsibility of those in the generation to listen to the Gedolei Torah of the generation. As we know, this famous story in the Gemara, when there was a machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and Yeshua on what day was Rosh Chodesh and ultimately what day Yom Kippur would fall. This is before there was the permanent calendar, when they were Makadesh al Pi Ha'Re'iyah, when they sanctified the new moon based on testimony of witnesses. So there was a machlokas. The Gemara tells us about a machlokas between Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua. So here on line 1, also Maisa Barama Gamliel, Shakavas Yom Kippurim Yom Mesuyam, he established that Yom Kippur would be on a certain day. Rabbi Yeshua Chalak Alav, and Rabbi Yeshua disagreed with his calculations. But nevertheless, Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi. So Rabbi Gamliel Gozer Alav, Rabbi Gamliel was Gozer. He decreed upon Rabbi Yeshua Sheyavo Etzlo Ba'osa Yom, that he should come to him on that day, the day that Rabbi Yeshua felt was Yom Kippur, but not the day that Rabbi Gamliel, as the Nasi, declared Yom Kippur. The day that Rabbi Yeshua felt was Yom Kippur, Rabbi Gamliel made him, Rabbi Yeshua, come to him, b'maklo v'tamilo, with his staff, with his backpack, in order to do something which would not normally be done on Yom Kippur, but he made Rabbi Yeshua do it. Despite his own feeling that it should be Yom Kippur, he did it anyway, because that's the rule. You have to go and you have to do what the shofet, what the judge, what the rav, what the gedolei Torah tell you, the leaders of the generation. And Rabbi Gamliel, as we said, was the Nasi, so Rabbi Yeshua had to acquiesce to his opinion. Listen to this story. Maisa Shahaya Bevilna Bismano Shalagra. There was a story that went back, that happened in Vilna during the lifetime of the Vilna Gaon. In the house of the tailor, who was a neighbor of the Vilna Gaon, a question arose regarding the kashrus of a chicken on Erev Shabbos. So the tailor sent one of his kids to ask his next door neighbor, the Vilna Gaon, what he thought of the shiloh on the chicken. And the Vilna Gaon said, it's treif. Can't eat the chicken. So the kid comes back, he puts the chicken on the shaved chicken or whatever it was on the table, and tells his father what happened. Eisha Sachai, the wife wasn't aware that the tailor had sent the son to the Gra, so Mrs. Taylor, what does she do? Shalo yod al kach. She didn't know this. She didn't know that her husband had sent one of her children to ask the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Avigdor Zatzal. So she sends one of her kids, go not to the Gra's house next door, but go to the Rav of Vilna, whose name was Rav Shmuel bar Avigdor. Want you to go to Rav Shmuel, the Rav of Vilna, not the Vilna Gaon, but the Rav of the Shul, and you'll ask him what he thinks about the chicken. Chazar Hayela, the kid goes, and then he comes back. V'amar shaharav pasak sha'of kosher. He paskin that it's a kosher bird. You can eat it, enjoy it for Shabbos. V'amavucha haisa gedola. Now the confusion was very great. What are we going to do? They both found out. The Gra says it's kosher. The Gra says it's treif. The Rav says it's kosher. What are we going to do? Chazru l'Rav. They went back to the Rav. V'amrulo. They tell the Rav now. Shagra pasak shagra tarnigola streifa. They go to the Rav and they say, Rabbi, I'm glad you told us it was kosher, but we asked the Gra, and the Gra said that it was treif. What happened? Halach harav lagon. The rabbis, Reb Shmuel bar Avigdor, went to the Vilna Gaon, v'omer lo. Ata omnam godol mimeni b'torah aseres monim. He says, I want you to know that you are 10 times greater than I am in learning. I admit that you are the gadol hador, and I'm really nothing. Ach, however, im nifso kamocha, if we follow what your psak is, and you said it's treif, tis ares samchusi karava ir. I will, unfortunately, my authority will be shaken, will unfortunately be shattered as the Rav of the ear. because they'll say, don't ask him, ask the Gra. Aleinu lavo lebeis hachai pelel Shabbos zeh v'lechol sham esa'of. So he says, you know what? He says, I want you to come to the house tonight, Shabbos, and eat the chicken. Do you hear that? The Vilna Gaon said it was treif. The rabbi said it was kosher. The Rav comes and says, listen, I said it was good. I'm the rabbi here. I know you're greater than me, but if what I said is ignored and they go for you, then my authority as the Rav is finished. So we have to say that the Rav's authority is important, and you need to come with me, and Friday night we'll sit and we'll enjoy the chicken in the house of the tailor next door. Okay? Aleinu lavo, you hear that? Aleinu lavo lebeis hachai pelel Shabbos zeh v'lechol sham esa'of. HaTorah eina tluya b'gaono shel agra. The Torah, this is what he said to him. The Torah is not based on the genius of the Gra, ela barava posek esa'ir. But the Torah has to be based on the Rav, the posek of the city, who makes the halachic decisions. Ani harav v'lo. I'm the rabbi and you're not. So, I appreciate what you said. I understand what you said, but I can't usurp my authority, and you need to come with me and show that you agree that it's kosher. V'hagra hiskim lo. And the Gra agreed. You hear that? The Gra agreed to eat the chicken that he knew, that he paskined was a treifa. But he understood what it meant, the authority of the Rav of the city. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. So what happened? They go to the Gra's house Friday night. They sit down. They sat down to eat the chicken. They're all sitting around the table, made kiddush, probably had, Vorspeis. They had some filter fish, maybe made a l'chaim, and they're about to have the chicken. But also rega nitak achevel shekosher as hamenorah l'tikra. The candelabra, which was hanging on the wall, this is before electricity, the candelabra, which was hanging and illuminating the room, the rope broke, the ner hachelev naf ala tocha tafshil, and the wax fell into the food, and it got ruined. The oil, the wax of the lamp over the table, spilling it into the chicken, and then the chicken was inedible. That's because HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. But the Gra sat down at the table to eat it. Tafkido shel harav eino kal. The job of the Rav is not easy. He has to have a pure heart without any other type of concerns. A person has many things that are not appropriate, many different concerns. He's looking for the truth, and he teaches based on his proper abilities, then he is a truthful representative of the Torah. There won't be any mistakes. If he's doing it l'shem shamayim for the proper reason, everything will be proper. And that's an unbelievable story to show you. The judge, the Rav, at that time, who the Rav is, we have to paskin like him, and an unbelievable story from the Gra about that. As we move on in the Parsha, we get to the section about the Melech. The Torah tells us that we need to appoint a king. And the Torah says, here are the psukim, Ki savo el haaretz, when you come into the land, Asher Hashem Elokecha nosein lach, that Hashem, your God, is giving you, the rishta, and you will possess it. the Yashaftaba, and you'll settle in it. The Yamarta, and you'll say, Asima alai melech kekala goyim asher svivosai. So what will you say? You will say, please let us have a king over ourselves like all the nations that are around us. So the Torah says, Som tasim alech melech. So then you'll place a melech, asher yivcha Hashem alekecha bo, who Hashem will choose, mikerav achecha, from the midst of your brothers, tasim alech melech, lo sucha lases ishnachri, shelo achicho. He has to be one of the brothers, and the Mefarshim all discuss, the Gemara discusses what exactly that means. But the Nitziv is bothered by one word in this pasuk Yadalit, and he's bothered by this word here, v'amarta. Again, let's look at the pasuk. Ki savo el haaretz asher Hashem Elokecha nosin lach, v'dirashta v'yirishta v'yashavta ba, v'amarta, and you will say. What does that mean, you will say? Says the Nitziv, v'amarta. Ain't a perish amir kimashma b'peh. It doesn't mean, and you will say, you will verbalize. Doesn't mean that. Ela kalashon v'amarta ochla basar, like we laid in Parshas Re'eh last week, v'amarta, and you will say, ochla basar, that I desire to eat meat. We're not talking about an actual verbalization of saying something, but you're showing your desire, showing your intention, you're just showing your want. So he says, Achein. That's what the Avamarta means here. Achein, lefi lashon zeh, hayabamashma she'ein zeh mitzvah b'muchlak. This is not a definitive mitzvah, an absolute mitzvah. Limnos melech el rishus. Kimo v'amarta ochla basar. There's no absolute requirement to eat meat. If you want to eat meat, the Torah says, then you have to shecht it and you have to go through the whole process of making sure it's kosher. But that's if you want to eat meat. You don't have to eat meat. You could eat something else. Same thing says the Nitzev here. The Amarta, you're going to say that you want a king, but it's not an absolute if you want. Wait a minute. The mitzvah l'mnos melech. We know that there is a mitzvah to appoint a king. So if that's the case, that the Amarta here means if you desire, if you want to do it, then what's the mitzvah? How do we reconcile that? Venira. Venira. The Mishum Dahanhagas Hamedina Mishtane. Says the Nitziv something fascinating. He says, Venira, the Mishum Dahanhagas Hamedina Mishtane in Misnagal Pi Das Malucha or Pi Das Ha'am V'nivchareim. He says that the king, each country, each society is different if it's led by a monarchy or al pi das ha'am v'nivchareim, or it's led as a democracy. There's a difference in countries that are led by monarchies and led by a democracy. There are some countries who wouldn't be able to deal with a monarchy. Let's think of the United States of America. And then there's countries that if they didn't have a strong leader, a king, a leader like that, it's like having a boat without a captain, without a leader. That can't be done with the mitzvah to say. The Torah can't tell you, do this, when it might not be possible for it to happen. Okay? The leadership of the country needs to match the society. And he says, that can't be forced on them by a mitzvah. Shadom mitzvah say, Mishamachi luafshalit savos beheklet nimnos melech. Kolzman shalo labas gamas omnis bol ol melech. You can't make a mitzvah to have a king unless the people are ready to have a king. Unless the people are in the frame of mind that they're going to be subject to a king. Al pisharon medinas ashish virosayim mehan nehagim beseder yoser nachon. That's the way they want to be. mitzvah say l'sanedrin l'smelach. Then maybe there's a mitzvah to appoint a king. You can't say that there's no mitzvah to appoint a king. But that's what it means, that if you desire a king. What? So he's saying, Hachanami, here on line 19. Davka asher yivchar. You have to choose. It has to be your desire. Okay? That why does the Torah say when you possess it and when you come to live in it? But we know that Yeshua was similar to a king. Okay? Ella al korchach, finishing up here, mitzvahu, umikol makom ein sanhedrin mitzuban ad sheyomru ha'am sharotzim b'hanagas hamelech. There is a mitzvah to appoint a king, says the Netziv. But that's what the Torah is adding with the word v'amarta. It has to be a decision that the people came to, that they're ready to be part of a monarchy. They're ready to be judged by a king. They're ready to have a king over them. And until they came to that decision on their own, for whatever reason, because the other people have it, they need it, whatever the reason is, that is the reason, that is the time that there'll be a mitzvah for you to now appoint a king. Umishum Hachi, says the Netziv to conclude, Kol Meshach Shalosh Meo Shana Shaya Mishkan Nivchar B'Shilo Lohaya Melech. Remember, the first king, Shaul, didn't become the king for the first at least 300 years, plus that Klal Yisrael had been in Eretz Yisrael from the time of Yoshua through the entire period of the Shoftim, and then Shmuel. There was no king until Shaul and ultimately David HaMelech. Beis HaMikdash was built by Shlomo 480 years after Yetzias Mitzrayim. So for 400 years, almost, if not that much, there was no king because they weren't ready for it. But then when they were ready for it, that's when the mitzvah was put into place. Because they weren't ready to have it. And we conclude this week's parsha with a phenomenal, beautiful thought by Rav Eliashiv. As you know, at the end of the parsha, the Torah tells us about going to war, and the Torah tells us that there are certain exceptions to going to war. The Torah tells us that before we go to war, so the Kohen makes an announcement and he says that someone, Mia Ish Asher Bana Bayis Chadash, somebody who built a new house and he hasn't yet inaugurated it, he should go home, he's exempt. Mia Ish Asher Nata Kerem V'Lochilolo, somebody who planted a vineyard and hasn't used it yet, so he can go home. And somebody who betrothed a woman and hasn't married her yet, he's allowed he is allowed to go home as well. So says Rav Eliashiv, HaTorah HaKadosha Kasva Eitzel Chozrei HaMilchama. The Torah told us about those who are allowed to leave from the war. As we just said, built a house, lest he die in the war, and someone else will be able to inaugurate the bias. And somebody else will take the vineyard. Lest somebody else takes his wife that he betrothed, and therefore he is exempt from war as well. Says Rav Eliashiv, he says, 1 second. Adam sheyesh lo kama binyanim shal shalosh v'arba komos hashavim meos alfayim. Somebody who has a bunch of buildings, 3 or 4 story buildings. Hashavim that is worth hundreds, thousands of dollars, shekel, whatever, some man of means. Ha'isha zeh mechuyev leleches. Ve'ein lo lochush pentipol nachlos la'acherim. Ve'isha zeh shabana bayis hamachzik dalet al dalet amos hu lo yochus al chayav pen ish yach nechenim. Rav Elyashiv is asking an interesting question. He says that the Torah exempts a person who builds a small house, let's say, 4 by 4, dalet al dalet, he writes here, small by 4, dalet al dalet, and has not yet lived in it. Yet someone who owns massive amount of real estate has to go fight, even if it happens that somebody will take over his real estate empire. The man who owns one little shack but hasn't yet inaugurated it, he's exempt. But the man who owns a portfolio of properties, he doesn't have his mind on what he's doing. He has to go to war. And similarly, someone who hasn't planted a few vines and hasn't yet been able to eat his grapes, he's exempt. But somebody who has acres and acres of grapes and vineyards, he does go to war. Guy planted a little vineyard over here, just a small thing. He's exempt. But the guy who owns acres and acres, he has to go to war. Somebody who has an established family, has 6, 7 children already. Lest he die, who's going to take care of his family? But if he became engaged without any major responsibility, he's exempt. How do you understand this? Says Rav Elyashiv. Ulam, the way to understand is as follows. A person who has built up great wealth does not specifically think about each property that he owns. Aval ha'ani, the poor man, asher kol yomav lo zachal l'sheves b'dalet amos mishalo, but the poor man who never had a chance to live in his own place, v'achshav, and now finally he gets the opportunity, kvar bana bayis mishalo, he just has a small shack. Right? Finally, he's able to have his own thing. That's all he's thinking about. A person who has tremendous properties, tremendous wealth, his thoughts in the battle will be turned towards the war. Let's get the war over with so I can get back to work. But the poor person, the person who has the small little, who just was able to build his own little house, never had a place in life to call his own, finally got to the place in life where he now is about to inaugurate his own house. He can't stop thinking about what's going to happen if he loses his house or his field or his wife. That's all he's thinking about. Finally, I've been looking around. I've been dating for years. I finally got engaged. I haven't had a chance to be with my wife yet. We haven't started our home yet. That's all I'm thinking about. But a person who has a family, yes, he's thinking about that, but that's not what he's focused on. He'll be thinking about the war and the purpose of what he's doing here. These people should go home. They should go home. Because that's all he's thinking about. Lest he dies, that he's not thinking about fighting the war. He's only thinking about his house or his vineyard or his betrothed wife. God forbid that's all he's thinking about, in danger of being killed. B'milchemes mitzvah, when it comes to a milchemes mitzvah, however, she milchemes Yoshua v'kibush aretz. This was all in a milchemes reshus, but a milchemes mitzvah to fight. For example, the milchama of Yoshua and the conquering the land. Einenu mishtachre b'shvil b'nai bayis kerem eretz ishto, and these exemptions don't apply. Sharei imein lo makom la'am Yisrael nachashiva shel bayis shelo o kerem hareinu b'tuch b'chalela, because if God forbid, in this Muhammad's mitzvah, where it is to establish Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, these are not exemptions, because Eretz Yisrael is the only place you have to have your vineyard and to have your home and to have your family. And without that, there's nothing guaranteed. As long as the land wasn't conquered before the Jewish people, there's nothing to be happy about. There's nothing to worry about. This is the primary focus at hand. And the idea, says Rav Elyashiv, is that in exempting these people from fighting a war, the Torah recognizes the psyche of people who see their dreams so close, yet is in the danger of eluding them. And that's because, he doesn't say it, but the idea behind this idea is Dracheha darchei noam, v'chol nesiv shalom. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. The Torah is concerned with the person's psyche, what a person thinks about, and therefore these are the people that are exempt under these circumstances.